Welcome to the Focus podcast on challenges in integration research. This podcast is based on the third Living Well Together online forum that took place on the 26th of January 2022. Focus is a research project on integration funded by the European Commission. Focus aims to make an impact on both research and practice by understanding and improving the dynamics of integration in Jordan, Croatia, Germany, and Sweden. In this episode, our Focus researchers, Naikari, Jana, Stefan, and Dana, talk about the challenges of doing research on integration and about their most compelling findings on the socioeconomic and the sociopsychological dimensions of integration.
So basically, what we tried to do was to explore the dynamics of integration and interrelation between the arriving and the receiving community in Jordan, Croatia, Germany, and Sweden.
Naikari Irastorsa is a senior researcher at Malmö University. Her research interests include international migration and integration, immigrants' participation in the labour market, and migration policies.
What did we do in our research? Basically, we had focus group interviews and a survey study in the four study countries, plus some secondary data analysis in Germany and Sweden. We could not do this in Croatia and Jordan because we did not have comparable data. We conducted 6 focus groups, 3 among the arriving community, and by arriving community, we mean refugees from Syria who arrived 4 years prior to the 2019, and the receiving community. And this we defined as people who have been born or living in the study countries for more than 7 years. We conducted these focus groups in 3 main cities in each country that received the largest amount of refugees from Syria in the last few years. The opening questions for both focus groups were slightly different. For the arriving community, they were: how integrated do you feel in the city where you live, in the country where you live? Whereas among the receiving community, we asked the following questions. For you personally, how did the integration of host and refugee community from Syria in your city and your country evolve? We will explain later on why we asked different questions. For the survey study, we conducted 2 surveys, one again among the receiving community and one among the arriving community. The target sample size for each group and country was 600, with a couple of exceptions. Among the arriving community, because of the small size of this group, the target size was 200. We conducted this survey in the same cities as the focus groups. The data collection method was a random walk technique in all countries, except for Sweden, where we used we selected a random sample from the population register. We asked about 60 questions on the socioeconomic situation of the arriving community and the factors that were related to this. The receiving community's perception of the arriving community's socioeconomic situation and its impact on the receiving countries, the intergroup relations between the arriving and receiving communities, and the characteristics of both groups facilitating or hindering integration. And of course, we looked at cross-country differences in all those themes, but especially in socio-psychological integration. In relation to the socioeconomic dimension of integration, we found that as expected, differences in employment remained a few years after migration. The employment gap between the arriving and receiving community was larger among women. The number of arriving community respondents who applied for the recognition of their qualifications was relatively low, half in Sweden, 1/3 in Germany, and even lower in Jordan and Croatia. And of course, the number of overqualified workers was higher among the arriving community than the receiving community. Finally, we also asked a few questions about housing, and we found that the share of arriving community members who lived in overcrowded dwellings and who said they lived in, they were overburdened with the price of the rent was high in all countries. 2 main conclusions could be that the receiving community members in all 4 countries were not quite aware of the situation of the arriving community in terms of employment and the number of those who were receiving welfare assistance. In general, the receiving community members' perception of the socioeconomic impact of the receiving community members was positive in Germany and Sweden, quite neutral in Croatia, and neutral to negative in Jordan. And some explaining factors could be differences in labor market competition, economic growth, and fiscal burden.
What we studied is the sociopsychological dimension of integration, which is basically a combination of different indicators of how the two groups, the arriving and the receiving community, live together, living well together being the title of our forum.
Jana Kiral is a researcher in the Department of Psychology at the University of Zagreb. The department is recognized as a regional leader in psychology research with extensive expertise in areas that are central to the research work in focus.
It is about the intergroup relations. And what we expect from a socio-psychological dimension of integration is basically to show us, are the intergroup relations constructive? Do they exist? What is the nature of the intergroup contact? Is it pleasant? Is it unpleasant? How frequent is it? Is there mutual respect, which is very important? Is there relating of social networks? Do the receiving and the arriving community have in their social network members of the other group? What are the levels of perception of intergroup threat? And finally, and most importantly, I would say, what do we see and say about the intergroup attitude? Are they positive? Are they neutral or negative? And what can we do about it? I have listed only a couple of findings which I thought were the most important ones to talk about right now. The first one was the difference in the intergroup attitudes. The arriving community across all countries, all 4 countries, showed positive attitudes towards the receiving countries. But what we found in the receiving communities is that they had neutral to moderately positive attitudes. So the AC perceived the RC more positive than vice versa. When we asked them about their sense of the arriving community being a part of the society in which they live, the arriving community did have this sense of society membership. They did feel that they are part of the society they now live in. But the receiving community had sort of a neutral sense. They sort of perceived the arriving community of being, well, sort of part of the community, but not a great part of the community. This also depends on the base of the country. When we talk about the perception of intergroup threat, the arriving community perceived a threat to their socioeconomic well-being more than a threat to their culture or way of life or norms. And the trend was opposite in the receiving community, who perceived a threat to their culture, norms, and way of life. Now, the important thing to say here is that when we look at the results themselves, they are somewhere around the middle of the scale. So they're quite neutral, but some trends are observable. When we come to intergroup contact, and intergroup contact is a factor which impacts all other aspects of social psychological integration. We found that the arriving community often has contact with the receiving community, which is also expected due to the nature of the sizes of the two groups. But the receiving community rarely has contact with the arriving community. We also asked the arriving community about their experiences of discrimination. We asked the receiving community whether they believe that the arriving community experiences discrimination. And the AC have reported some experience of discrimination, but coming from different methodologies from focus groups in the survey, we see that they seem to downplay the actual frequency of such experiences, which is concerning. The receiving community do recognize that such events occur regularly, but I think this is a point in which enabling the AC to talk openly about this is very much important. What we can take from the qualitative research at this point is that there are polarized attitudes of the receiving community towards the arriving community. This was very prominent. So on one side, we have the opinion of the receiving community that the arriving community is vulnerable. We have an image of vulnerable and traumatized refugee. And then on the other side, we have an image of parasitical, potentially criminal refugee. And these two views mix. But neither of them is one that we would like to encourage in the receiving community. And what's very interesting is that refugees from Syria were perceived as better refugees than other migrants and refugees from the Middle East and surrounding countries. And this is very interesting because of the nature of the migration in the last decade from the Middle East to Europe. And socioeconomic hardships in the country, particularly in Croatia and Jordan, were seen as very influential for the overall intergroup relations between the AC and the RC. I remember one of the participants in Croatia saying, the relations can't be good if we are competing for the same jobs.
The idea of two-way dynamic integration conceives integration as a two-way process of mutual adaptation between the arriving and receiving communities, a complex and controversial concept not easy to integrate in research design.
And indeed, integration is a very much contested concept. We did not challenge it theoretically, but instead of doing that, we tried to test it empirically. And to our knowledge, this is quite a novel attempt of doing so. So in order to do this, the initial idea was to ask the same questions to both groups. And most of the questions asked in the survey and the focus groups were similar for both groups, but some of them were not. And this was because of different reasons. One was that the receiving community did not understand what we were asking when we asked them to talk about their own integration. Another reason was that for practical reasons related to the length of the survey, we decided not to ask certain questions to the receiving community. And we are now aware that by doing this, we were putting more weight on the arriving community's experiences, and therefore perhaps challenging this idea of integration as a two-way process of mutual adaptation. In relation to this, migrant integration or incorporation, participation in society, from a traditional point of view, which is closer to the ideas of assimilation, it can be measured in different ways. One of them is by taking the mean of the indicators for the receiving community as a reference. This is, for example, common practice in labor market studies, and again, closer to the idea of assimilation. We could also look at integration or measure it by taking the means of the indicators of the arriving community in source countries, in sending countries as a reference, or we could ask respondents about their own goals in different domains of integration, again, like in employment. So we could ask them, so what is your goal in terms of employment, social life, etc. in the country where you live now? And then we could compare their achievements or their experiences to their goals. We followed the first approach, so we took the means of the indicators for the receiving community as a reference, and we compared the means of the arriving community against this. And this raises another question, and this is, so who forms the receiving community? And the one thing that we did in order to avoid complete assimilationist approach was to include the foreign-born people who have been living in the country, in the study countries for more than 7 years as part of the group of the receiving community. So instead of only including the native-born population. And by doing this, we changed the composition of the reference group, and we tried to do it more dynamic.
We have, as Nahikari and Janab already mentioned, we had on one hand this whole idea of translating the idea of two-way dynamic integration into a questionnaire and to assess it in these 4 countries. How does it look like? What is the state of intergroup relation? What's the state of socioeconomic integration? And what are the factors influencing it?
Dana Abdel Fattah is trained in public policy and is a researcher at the Berlin Institute for Empirical Integration and Migration Research Team, affiliated to Humboldt University Berlin. Dana has been researching in the field of critical migration and integration studies with a focus on racism.
And for that, you, of course, need quantitative research, which follows predefined constructs and categories that we have to assess against it. So it's very much focused on numbers, on statistical analysis. And you've got, of course, the other side, the qualitative research, which is there to contextualize, to provide in-depth information, illustrative information, about the whole issues we're discussing on integration.
Research that integrates arriving and receiving communities with their very different mindsets and perspectives requires awareness for power asymmetries and an open design that doesn't impose predefined concepts.
And in order to achieve this, we tried to define a very open focus group guideline that allows for space that participants from both communities can bring up their views and experiences, like with minimum interference by our preconceptions.
Stefan Schudvel is a trained psychotherapist. He is a researcher at the Department of Psychiatry at the Charité University Hospital in Berlin. He works in the field of transcultural psychotherapy and psychosocial support for people with migratory background.
But certain challenges arose when we tried to do that and realize the concept of dynamic integration. First was with regard to the composition of the focus groups. We had to decide whether to hold separate or mixed groups. As already has been revealed, we decided for separate groups. On the one hand, if we separate, we may better succeed in offering a safe space to open on sensitive topics, especially those regarding power dynamics like the manifestations of racism and discrimination. On the other hand, we lose the chance to observe and discuss integration issues in a dialogue between the two communities, which the concept of a dynamic integration would request us to do. So we chose for the first argument, opted for separate groups. This decision being made, there was a next challenge. And should we ask the same question? The dynamic concept of integration would request us in this matter as well to have the same question for both groups. But then we did a pilot testing of this approach, and it was revealed that the receiving community respondents went to a total different direction in their contributions or in their answers. This would have required quite strong intervention from the moderator, and thus again imposing concepts of integration on the participants, which we did not want to do. So we decided to have different questions. So to repeat it, we asked, how integrated do you feel for the arriving community and for the receiving community? How do you think the integration of the arriving community evolved in the respective site? We were conducting the focus groups. It's a finding that we could not ask the same question with both communities. And what became more apparent in the results that even though the receiving community kind of hypothetically refers to a concept of dynamic integration, they really struggle to translate this into their personal living context and responsibility.
Recent integration research has shown that racism and discrimination are major barriers to integration.
I think some of our findings as well in this research, and Jana has briefly mentioned it, that it's extremely difficult to talk about racism, or it has been in our research extremely difficult, especially among the arriving community, because of, again, the power asymmetries. We felt that there, especially in the qualitative research, whenever racism was brought up, there was this strong urgency to take it back and say, I mean, do not misunderstand us. We're not saying that the German society, for example, is really bad, but actually, no, they are extremely helpful in everything. And there is, in one of the focus group discussions, for example, in Hamburg, one participant actually said it, and there was immediately an attack from all participants. Why would you use this term? It's not, I think it's not, you're not being grateful enough. You're denying all what Germany has offered you. So it's really difficult. I think we should, again, talk about methods. How do we explore this phenomenon more, and how do we even offer the space? I mean, maybe a hypothesis would be also that arriving community refuse to see themselves as victims. That might be another explanation. We have not observed this. And actually, our research builds on other observations from other research. For example, in Scotland, where qualitative research has also found out that in general, refugees tended to downplay the experiences of racism because of fear, because of doubting that they are part of the society, doubting the fact if they are entitled to make such statements.
I would just like to briefly reflect on the way that we have study discrimination in the quantitative work, so in the survey. And here we encountered an issue of asking the same questions, which we already talked about a lot today. We asked the arriving community members on the frequency of their experiences of discrimination in different areas of life, in work, in public, in school, while looking for work and for accommodation. But we couldn't ask the receiving community, how often do you discriminate against the arriving community? Or how often do you experience or express discrimination or racism attitudes? So this is an issue of studying certain phenomena in cross-group, so in intergroup relations. The arriving community cannot discriminate against the receiving community. They cannot be racist towards the receiving community because of the power relations. And then when you're trying to research this, you have to adapt it in some way.
I do not believe that we could not have asked this question to the receiving community, because as I said, the receiving community was, as we defined it, is not only composed of native-born people, but also of previously arrived migrants. And even if it was only the native-born population, perhaps not so many in Croatia, but in Germany, in Sweden, in Jordan probably as well, there are native-born people from different ethnic origins. So there is definitely discrimination and racism against the native-born population. We did not ask about this, but we could have.
In order to be aware of being treated unequally, arriving community members must be aware of their rights and entitlements.
We actually studied the knowledge of the arriving community members of the rights they have. So we did this in the survey portion. So what we did is we found the law guaranteed rights that they have in the 4 countries, the 4 study countries. And we asked them in the survey whether they have this right or not. And the answers were yes, no, or I don't know. And what we found is that they are aware of their rights. In a very high percentage, they did know that they have all of these rights. Some of them were more known to them, some of them a bit less. But overall, they were very much acquainted with their rights. So I would say that the arriving community members do know their rights, but that the receiving community members in some areas are not aware of them. And then I believe this is a very big problem.
I think it's very difficult to, at least through a survey, to get a sense of whether to capture these kind of hidden discriminatory practices. Because, for example, I think it would be difficult for any arriving community member to tell sometimes whether they have had unequal treatment, even if we ask that directly, because perhaps they don't have anything to compare. I mean, they have not been in the position of a receiving community member who has received the same service. So sometimes when it's very obvious, they will say, yes, I think I have, but there are also like very subtle ways of doing things differently, or perhaps just by not giving the same kind of information, or not giving enough information, or perhaps not being as friendly. And this is difficult to capture through a survey.
I think we need a completely different design to measure institutional racism. And we should also keep in mind the limitations of any instrument of perceived discrimination. And there are different, we know, for example, that be acknowledging or identifying that, for example, as this is discrimination is highly correlated with education, with certain factors. And this is why there's also an urge for more and more research that measures more rigorously inequality between certain groups. For example, in health, looking into certain indicators, I don't know, in emergency rooms, waiting hours. And again, our finding on that many people are hesitant even to talk about it or do not know if this was discrimination or what, makes things very complicated. So perceived discrimination is actually a very common used instrument, but it also has a lot of limitations.
Generational and family aspects can be important facilitators to integration. Integration experience may change depending on whether families are involved or not, or depending on the age of the people concerned, as Jeremy Leonard from the Australian Red Cross pointed out.
I think, yeah, look, we've seen differing outcomes depending on whether new arrivals are part of a family unit with school-age children or they're single or couples. And it's, to what the researchers found, kind of economic participation or that kind of community integration.
But what I do recall from the qualitative study is that two very important things. The receiving community saw age as a facilitator and a barrier at the same time, with the receiving community respondents believing that younger people were more prone to being open, at least in Croatian focus groups. But I think the age was also brought up in other focus groups as well. So this notion that younger people, because of globalization and technology and communication in this new times, that they were more open to the arriving community members. So this is what the receiving community said. And then I very vividly recall the arriving community members saying, and a girl which was in high school saying, I help my mom. She doesn't speak Croatian and she doesn't speak English very well. So when she needs to take care of some sort of administrative or bureaucratic business, I go with her and I translate and I communicate for her.
So something we've found is that in schools that have a higher proportion of newly arrived students, actually it's the children of the receiving community are advocates of change with their parents, which is actually quite interesting in terms of changing their attitudes, because parents are obviously interested about what their kids are learning at school, who their friends are. And we've actually found that to be a really positive instrument of change.
I think a main lesson learned, or future suggestion as well, is I think the importance of giving time and space to reflect in the research group is really, really important, especially when working in an interdisciplinary team where academic language is different, viewpoints are different, understandings are different.
I would say have an interdisciplinary team. Have a team of people who come from different backgrounds, who are experts in different things. We have a very strong interdisciplinary team, from clinical psychologists to social psychologists to political researchers to labor market experts. We have covered everything, because integration is a multidimensional and interdisciplinary topic.
I am not completely sure if we had to do this again. I'm not completely sure if I would again design the empirical research on a normative concept that it's perhaps a little bit far from reality. I think I would prefer to have a more exploratory approach to the research problem and then see what we find.
Yes. If anything, I think I would like to, when researching integration issues, I would like to work more with participatory approaches, where I feel that participants have joint collaboration at all stages of research with the researchers. So not only in terms of defining and designing questionnaires and so on, but also in terms of analyzing them, because I think this is the only way that we alter a bit the imbalance in knowledge production.
On this note, we would like to close this Focus podcast on challenges in integration research. We hope you enjoyed it, and we look forward to welcoming you to another episode or to our final conference in June. For further information, check the Focus website and sign up to our newsletter.